The history of Indonesia in the second half of the 20th century is one that combines many of the threads and themes of the Cold War. This includes such things as nationalism, decolonization, ideological conflict, military rule, mass atrocity, foreign involvement, and domestic exploitation of that foreign involvement. In a past episode, we looked at a failed CIA-sponsored coup that took place in 1958. I'm your host David, and today we are returning to Indonesia to look at a different failed coup, one that sparked mass killings across Indonesia in what many describe as a genocide. Today we are looking at Indonesia's failed 30th of September movement, commonly referred to as G30S. This is the Cold War. Indonesia secured its independence from the Netherlands in 1949 and spent the next decade flirting with parliamentary democracy. It was during this period that Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, looking to secure his own power in the face of growing dissent, gradually began implementing more and more authoritarian measures. Following a failed CIA-backed 1958 coup attempt, he dissolved parliament, replacing it with a complicated system of balances between the three most powerful political actors in the country: the military, the communists, and the Islamists. Relations between Jakarta and the West, and especially the United States, which had been instrumental in helping to secure Indonesian independence the previous decade, had largely soured during the 1950s and included the 1958 coup attempt. During the same time period, communist power and influence had continued to grow, with the Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI, establishing itself as a political force to be reckoned with. With 3 million members, it was not only the third largest communist party in the world, but it was also the world's largest non-ruling communist party by 1965. Sukarno looked to establish Indonesia as a significant international player by becoming an advocate for anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism through such things as the creation of the non-aligned movement. This brought him into conflict with the West, including of course Great Britain, but also the United States. While the US was a nation that publicly championed anti-imperialism and decolonization, it did so more readily if it was being done in a way where Washington could benefit. As Sukarno challenged the Western powers through such actions and events as the Konfrontasi and the nationalization of Western-owned assets, he looked to leverage these actions domestically, drawing the otherwise fractured peoples of Indonesia together in a common cause. This type of appeal increased the support, role, and power of the PKI in Indonesian political life. But this didn't go unnoticed or without challenge. The military, which had been closely aligned to the West, receiving large amounts of arms and supplies from them, also looked to solidify their own political role and power. But it is extremely important to note that the military was itself not a unified single body with common political opinion. Much of the high command was anti-communist in nature, but the Air Force bucked that trend and tended to be sympathetic to the left, even cultivating strong procurement ties with the Soviet Union. The commanders of the Presidential Guard were also largely considered to be communist sympathizers. Related to this, the PKI called for the creation of a fifth branch of the military to be composed of workers and peasants. This was actually an idea that had been put forward by the People's Republic of China and had found support with Sukarno, who was developing increasingly closer ties to Beijing. The army, however, and as you might expect, was vehemently opposed to the plan, fearing that this fifth branch would be used as a key component in a future takeover of the country. The proposal also served to further alienate the army and the communists from each other. In reaction, the communists began an informal campaign designed to discredit the Council of Generals, accusing them of sabotaging Sukarno with the ultimate intent of usurping power. Now, the creation of a worker army never actually happened. This, however, didn't stop several thousand communists undergoing military training at Halim Air Base, the main airfield outside Jakarta. So we can see that Indonesian society by the early 1960s was fracturing along ideological lines, with those fractures replicating themselves in significant political organizations like the military. But divides like this are not altogether unusual in many societies and do not inevitably lead to strife. So what happened? Well, Sukarno's health happened. In his mid-60s at this point, Sukarno's health began to decline, and the knowledge that he would die at some point in the near future encouraged the various political factions to begin jockeying and preparing for a post-Sukarno Indonesia. Specifically, the PKI and their sympathizers in the military feared that the right-wing generals would be in a key position to assume power on Sukarno's death and lead Indonesia in a direction that they did not particularly like. Sukarno, for his part, plowed ahead, however, announcing in his 1965 Independence Day speech that Indonesia would ally itself to the People's Republic of China, as well as other anti-imperial communist nations, warning the military not to interfere. The stage was set for a showdown. From this came the 30th of September movement, often just referred to as G30S. Through 1965, there had been rumblings and rumors on both the left and the right about each side planning a preventative coup. On the left, groups of officers joined together to form G30S and take the first steps before a similar action happened from the right. G30S had some support from the PKI, although the exact nature and extent of that support is something still under debate by scholars. The movement was led by Lieutenant Colonel Untung, a battalion commander in the Presidential Guard. He was joined by Army Brigadier General Suharto, Major Suyono at Halim Air Base, as well as several senior members of the PKI, among others. At the end of September 1965, Sukarno was informed of a possible coup attempt being organized. He, however, dismissed the threat as fake news, disinformation and rumor being created by the right-wing elements of the military looking to take their own actions against the left. In the hours before the launching of the coup itself, the General Secretary of the PKI, D.N. Aidit, arrived at Halim Air Base, what would become the de facto headquarters for the conspirators. There is some debate over Aidit's motives for showing up at Halim, ranging from active participation in the coup to simply seeking shelter from a suspected coup being planned by the right wing. In the early hours of October 1st, G30S began to move. Soldiers from the Presidential Guard and the Pemuda Rakyat, the PKI youth militia, were sent to the houses of 7 of the leading right-wing generals. 3 of the targets were killed, 3 were captured, but one, the most important target, Defense Minister Nasution, managed to escape to the Iraqi embassy by jumping over a garden wall. The 3 captured generals were taken to Halim Air Base, where they were tortured and then killed, their bodies then being dumped into a well near the base. While these actions were underway, rebel groups moved to capture the radio station, the telephone exchange, and key intersections throughout Jakarta. Sukarno was not at the presidential palace when the coup was launched, instead being at the house of one of his wives. His reaction upon finding out about the coup was to relocate to Halim Air Base. This has often been perceived as his support for the coup, given this happened to be where the plotters had set up their main base. However, Sukarno later gave testimony that his decision to relocate to Halim was based on having access to aircraft in the event that he had to flee the capital. At 7 a.m. on October 1st, Lieutenant Colonel Untung made a radio broadcast declaring the seizure of power by the 30th September movement against the Council of Generals, including accusations that the generals were planning their own coup backed by the CIA. He also announced the creation of the Indonesian Revolutionary Council. Despite this, it was becoming clear that the coup was not going well. On the afternoon of the 1st, the rebels broadcast the names of the members of the Revolutionary Council, but one key name was omitted. Sukarno's name was not on the list. The military, for its part, began to move into action. It's at this point that we should introduce General Suharto, who had risen to prominence during the war against the Dutch and whose star had continued to increase in brightness during the post-independence period. Suharto had been heavily involved in quelling domestic rebellions, as well as exerting pressure on newly independent Malaysia, and had been made Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army in 1960. The next year, he was also given command of Kostrad, the Strategic Reserve, an air-mobile reaction force designed to quickly react to evolving situations. The G30S leaders had assumed Suharto to be a Sukarno loyalist, and despite his prominence, he was not targeted in the kidnapping of the generals as a result. On the morning of October 1st, 1965, on hearing of the killing and kidnapping of his fellow generals, Suharto quickly assessed that the leadership had been decapitated and moved to act. He mobilized both Kostrad as well as the Indonesian Special Forces, quickly asserting his own leadership over the wider military. Suharto, hearing the radio broadcast naming the Revolutionary Council and realizing the omission of Sukarno's name, understood that the rebels did not have the full support of the president. When Sukarno realized that Suharto was ignoring a direct order to report to Halim Air Base, Sukarno left the airbase, traveling the 50 kilometers or so to his summer palace in Bogor, south of Jakarta. Untung and the other conspirators, realizing that their plan was unraveling, soon also fled from Halim. Suharto was working to ensure that there was no infighting within the military, fearing that bloodshed could spark a wider civil war. Suharto's men convinced Battalion 454, guarding the presidential palace, to step down and leave, having explained to them that there was nobody home and they were guarding an empty building. Soldiers loyal to Suharto also convinced the rebels at the radio station to leave, although that required a more broad threat of the use of force. The rebel headquarters at Halim was next. Ensuring that Sukarno had left the base, Suharto deployed a regiment of troops, including 13 tanks, against the airbase. Despite this show of force, he also gave orders to refrain from shooting if possible, and by 6 a.m. on the morning of October 2nd, the airbase had been secured without any bloodshed. Of course, this only gives information on events in and around Jakarta. Keeping in mind that Indonesia is a huge country made up of thousands of islands, the coup took longer to quell in other regions. It took until October 4th, for example, for the rebels to surrender in Yogyakarta in central Java. In Surakarta, northeast of Yogyakarta, it took until October 24th for the rebellion to be put down. This had allowed PKI groups to not just attack police and army units, but carry out pogroms against anti-communists in general. It took commando units of the army to force their surrender, but with that, the attempted coup was over. The aftermath of the G30S coup was long and bloody, with hundreds of thousands of Indonesians being killed in what has often been described as a genocide. We are going to be taking a close look at that series of events in a later episode, but before we get to that, we need to unpack the arguments and discussions that surround who was responsible for instigating the coup itself. And the reason this becomes so important is because it has been used to justify the years of killing and subsequent repression that followed. Okay, so we know that G30S was led by several disgruntled generals and officers from the Indonesian military, as well as 2 members of the PKI. Does this mean that the PKI, the communists, were actually behind the coup? This is where the debate exists. The official version says that yes, the PKI was the group responsible, and not just the individual members that took part, but the PKI as a whole. And towards that conclusion, there is a good deal of evidence. It's been reported that the PKI chairman, Aidit, had informed Mao Zedong during an August visit to Beijing of the planned upcoming coup. Aidit, you will recall, was at the coup headquarters at Halim when the coup was underway. It was PKI youth and women's wings that were involved in the killings of the kidnapped generals. These were also the forces that the coup leaders heavily relied on. Harian Rakyat, the official PKI newspaper, published an editorial expressing its support for Untung and the coup. But later court testimonies cast some doubt over the complicity of the entire PKI. The testimony, made by several PKI members starting in 1967, detailed the existence of an organization within the PKI named the Special Bureau. The Special Bureau was a secret group of 5 men tasked with infiltrating the Indonesian military to recruit communist sympathizers and then maintain contact between the PKI and its supporters within the army. It was headed by a man named Siam, and he reported directly to the PKI chairman, Aidit. The Special Bureau was so secret that, with the exception of Aidit and only a few other senior PKI officials, nobody knew of its existence, let alone its activities. In his testimony, Siam stated that it was he, working with Aidit, who prepared the list of targets for the G30S coup, as well as the statements made by the coup organization. Siam was executed in 1986 for his leadership role in the PKI. So the official explanation that the PKI as an entire organization was complicit already had some doubt being cast on it. Then, in 1971, an alternate theory was put forward by Benedict Anderson and Ruth McVeigh, an unpublished academic study that has become known as the Cornell paper. In the work, Anderson and McVeigh assert that it was not a PKI plot, but rather an internal army affair. They argued that the army officers from the Diponegoro division upset that Central Java, which had long been the traditional heart of Javanese power, had been usurped by Jakarta. Officers, including Untung, believed that other generals in the army were collaborating with the CIA, planning their own seizure of power. The G30S coup was then launched as a preventative coup. Anderson and McVeigh claimed that since the PKI was politically doing quite well in Indonesia and was still expanding its own influence in the period before the coup, they would have had little reason to launch the coup. Instead, it was the Air Force, already training members of the PKI, you will remember, who initiated the collaboration with the PKI. The rebel officers needed soldiers who were not already loyal to the military, and the PKI troops offered the most obvious solution. Aidit's presence at the Halim Air Base was explained as an attempt by the Air Force to prevent the PKI from taking advantage of the destabilized environment and from winning over Sukarno to the side of the G30S plotters. So, where does that leave us? Clearly the PKI was involved in the coup. The evidence to that is quite plain and evident. PKI chairman was at the coup headquarters, the youth and women's branches of the PKI supplied the muscle for the coup attempt, and the party newspaper openly provided its support. PKI members demonstrated in favor of the coup across Indonesia, and the Special Bureau existed specifically to recruit subversive members within the ranks of the military. There isn't any doubt of their involvement. So I'll ask, does this mean that the entire organization was then complicit? Much of the PKI leadership had no idea that a coup was being planned, and then had no involvement once it had been launched. Was the PKI even the senior partner in their coalition with sympathetic army officers, or were they being used by the latter? This remains a murky subject and is open to debate even today. But why is this important, some of you may be asking? Well, its importance, beyond simply an accurate historical narrative, is because of what happened next. Suharto and the military, as we've already discussed, officially blamed the PKI for the coup, and a massive purge was conducted across Indonesia that lasted several years. Actual communists, suspected communists, and many others who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time were subjected to repressions, pogroms, disappearances, and outright massacres. These killings were perpetrated by both the Indonesian military, as well as sponsored and non-sponsored militia groups, and Western support, including from the CIA and the US State Department, was provided to further the violence. Indonesia would see hundreds of thousands of people killed and millions more arrested as Suharto's authoritarian regime established itself in the wake of the G30S coup. But, as I mentioned earlier, we are not going to be looking at that today, but rather in a future episode. To make sure you don't miss that episode and any of our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is hiding at an airbase south of town, waiting to see if it needs to flee the country or not. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.